We're going to move to our next speaker of the afternoon, Mahacek, who did a thesis on estimating population demographics of the Edwin St. George Reserve deer herd using camera traps. He was advised by Nate Sanders, and his reader was Kirby Mills.
Sorry, it's not letting me share yet. There we go. Okay, thanks to everyone for coming. My name is Mac, and as Shelley said, I tried to estimate the population demographics of the George Reserve deer herd. So just to start off, a little background of the reserve. It was donated to the university in 1930 and has been owned and managed by them ever since. It's a little over 1,000 acres, and it is located in PitE, Michigan, which is about a half hour or so northwest of Ann Arbor. And what's really unique about this property is that it's surrounded by 11.5-foot high fence. So the deer population on the reserve is unable to leave the reserve at all. So it's an entirely isolated population. So this herd in particular has been very well studied. In 1928, when Edwin St. George first purchased the reserve, deer had been extirpated from southern Michigan. And so he built a fence around his property and introduced 4 females and 2 males. And these are thought to be the founding members of the population. Following that, a couple years later is when he donated the property to the university. And then in 1933, they started having annual deer drives to estimate the population size. This consisted of a large group of people lining up across the reserve and walking across it. And then as you pass a deer, if a deer ran by, say to your right, then you would count that deer. And at the end, everyone would add up the number of deer they saw, and that would provide their estimate. They also had, starting in 1952, they would collect the jawbones of all deceased deer, and then they could age the deer based on their jawbones and kind of reconstruct the population in retrospect based on the age of the jawbones of deceased deer. So there's been so many studies on the reserve on this deer herd. Dale McCullough actually wrote a book about it, so I had the pleasure of reading this book as part of my research. And there's a lot of interesting ecology within the book and a lot of interesting studies that have gone on. So for the past 20 years or so, no one has really studied the herd. For the most part, there's been a couple small studies, but my goal was to really try and recapture this connection between researchers and the herd. I specifically wanted to look at the population demographics, such as population size, sex ratio, and age structure. And I wanted to do this all using camera traps. So for my methods, I placed 8 cameras on the property. Initially, we actually placed 12 cameras. Upon checking them a couple of days later to make sure everything was running properly, 4 of the cameras were malfunctioning, whether that was battery issues or just not working properly. So we proceeded with only 8 cameras. And we tried to have the cameras set from October 18th, which was the initial day we set them, until the end of December. Unfortunately, as cold weather rolls in, the cameras tend to die. So December 3rd was the last day that we actually had usable data because it was so cold after that date that none of the cameras were able to hold a charge. So in total, we ended up with 219 total camera trap days when considering the battery issues that we had. When setting the cameras, we tried to focus on areas of high deer activity. This might include scrapes or rubs from bucks, or just deer trails that deer appear to be traveling a lot. Similar camera trap studies that have been done usually use bait, but baiting is illegal in Michigan because of the spread of CWD. And so even though we have kind of this private population where we legally would have probably been able to get away with it, we felt that it was most ethical to not contribute to the spread of this disease and proceed without bait. So that was a little handicap we had, but we still were able to get usable data. So the first part of this was to try and identify each individual male. So the male deer each have a unique set of antlers. So when we would get pictures of them, I would basically just look at a lot of pictures, try and compare them side by side to determine which male was showing up on the camera in a sort of mark and recapture kind of style. So if you look at this first deer on the left here, you'll notice his antlers are fairly symmetrical. He has 8 points. His brow tines are pretty short. And a kind of identifying feature I'm going to use for this deer is that his left antler appears to be lower than his right antler. But again, this deer is not like super unique. So this is one that might be a little more difficult for me to identify. This next deer is more unique. You see this little extra point on the back of his right antler. And you also see like his antlers tend to be kind of squiggly, not super straight. So especially this point right here, squiggly, and then this kind of loopy style back antler. And so then when you look to this next picture, which was of course at a different time, again, you see this little point back here and the kind of the squiggly style antlers again. So that's how you can identify that this is the same deer. And so this just involved a lot of looking at pictures very closely by myself to identify individual deer. Following that, we're able to use the estimates of the total number of deer and the frequency that males and females would show up on camera to estimate both the sex ratios and the population size from that for both males and females. So for this, we also had to consider that some of the camera locations were heavily male biased because a lot of the deer signs, such as scrapes and rubs, are laid down by male individuals. So for example, this camera that was set up here for this picture, over the 40 some days that it was set, it didn't capture a single female deer on it, but it had actually collected quite a bit of data. So when considering sex ratios, this is a camera that we might ignore in some of our calculations just because it's producing kind of biased data. And then lastly, we tried to classify each individual male into an age class. For this, we had 3 age classes: immature deer, juvenile deer, and mature deer. Immature deer were deer that we thought were 1.5 years old. Juvenile deer were deer that we thought were 2.5 or 3.5 years old. And the mature deer were deer that I thought were 4.5 years or older. For this, from cameras, it is a little difficult. So I'm going to kind of walk you through my process for determining each age class of the deer. So when looking at pictures, we focused on 3 main things. That would be the neck, the stomach, and the legs. So this, of course, is an immature deer here. So if you'll notice, the neck here is quite skinny. The legs are also appear to be pretty long and kind of gangly, if you will. And then the stomach is taut. It's not at all saggy. And there's little muscle definition in the legs as well. So when you look at a juvenile deer, which is just a year or 2 older than that, you'll notice here the neck is a little bit thicker. You have more muscle definition, and the belly is just a little bit saggy. It's not super saggy yet. So if I go back and you compare them, especially pay attention to the neck. That's kind of the telltale sign here. But the neck tends to get bigger as they age. So when you look at mature deer here, this one, of course, has a huge neck. You can't really even determine the difference between the neck and the shoulder here. The legs also kind of look short and stubby as they get older. And then another thing that people kind of see with dogs as well is they get this kind of tuft of fat or skin in this chest belly area as they get older. And so that's kind of another telltale sign that this is an old deer. So generally, when looking at these deer, we would notice that the mature deer were very easy to identify and the immature deer were very easy to identify because they had significant traits, specifically the neck. So when we compile this all together, I found that there were actually more males on the reserve than females. And this was actually a significant difference. There's about 60% as many females as males, which is quite surprising. And we also found that for every female, on average, about a third of the females had a fawn with them. So from those estimates, we were able to estimate the population size. Again, we found 31 individual males. This is going to be a conservative estimate because, of course, some males just simply may have never walked in front of the camera, and some males also may not have had unique enough antlers to identify them when compared to other individuals. So this is a conservative estimate, but also should be considered a fairly accurate one. And then when we look at the number of females, again, this is 60% of the number of males. So this estimated 18 females, about 7 fawns, and 56 total deer on the property. This is kind of an interesting structure because you would expect to see more females than males typically. It's kind of important to note that the previous year, the call on the property did take off 12 females and only 2 males. So this might account for the differences, but it is kind of an interesting finding here. And then lastly, for the age structure, we identified 13 individual males that were immature, 10 that were juveniles, and only 8 that were mature. I think it's also important here to remember that these buckets, if you will, aren't exactly the same size. So these juvenile deer are 2 age classes, and the mature deer are 4.5 years or older. So this age structure is going to be even more skewed towards immature deer than this graph shows. However, it's also important to note that there's still a good amount of mature deer and juvenile deer on the property. It's not all immature deer. So it's kind of what you would expect in an age structure of a deer population. So looking at this in a broader sense, I think that understanding the demographics of the population is just important when making management decisions. So this property is regularly called by the university, and so understanding what deer are on the herd or on the property is important for making those decisions. It's also valuable because it's been so well studied historically, so maintaining that connection between researchers and the deer population is valuable to see how the population has changed over time. And then lastly, we also see that a lot of other literature on population demographics of publicly hunted herds varies a lot when compared to the deer on the reserve. So you'll see much more female biased sex ratios and more immature age structures in studies that have been done on publicly hunted herds compared to this study on deer on the reserve, which is pretty interesting. So lastly, I'd just like to conclude by thanking my advisor, Nate Santers, for his help throughout the process. He was very helpful in both designing the study and throughout the writing process. So a huge thanks to him. I'd also like to thank Alex Wenner for his help. He was the property manager at the reserve, and so he was a lot of help in placing the cameras and also just keeping up on checking them. And he's a super knowledgeable guy, so he was very helpful throughout everything. And also on a side note, I'd like to thank Jason for running his seminar course. Without a course like that, I probably never would have taken on this project. So huge thanks to him for his guidance and help throughout everything. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Mac. Great job. We have time for a couple questions.
Hey, Mac, I have one. This is Nate. This is one that I've wanted to ask you since you first started this project, but I saved it for today. What other cool wildlife did you see in these cameras? I mean, I've asked you to, show me the pictures of the deer all the time, but what other stuff did you see?
Yeah, sure. There was quite a bit. I saw coyotes a lot, which was pretty cool. And you'd be surprised how frequent you'd have a coyote run by with like an animal in its mouth.
Oh, wow.
Which was pretty cool. A lot of turkeys, a lot of raccoon. There was possum on there. Anything else slipping my mind, but yeah, there's a lot of different animals that we saw on the cameras.
Very cool. Aside from the deer population, the other well-studied taxa out there are the turtles. And so we know a lot about population demographics of those turtles, and coyotes are one of their most important predators. So we should probably do a better job of tracking coyotes as well, I guess. But great job, Mac. Super impressive.
Jason.
So maybe this is kind of jumping off of Nate's question, but am I right, Mac, in thinking that there's not any real natural predators for the deer at that location? Right, it's just basically the cull that happens maybe once a year, and that's pretty much it. Is that true?
Yeah, correct. The coyotes will occasionally eat deer, especially fawns. But there have been a number of studies recently that have come out that suggest coyotes really impact the movement of deer more than they actually predate on them. So there's not really any predators on the population. And yeah, calls have been done basically since the beginning of the herd to manage the population.
The other thing that struck me, Mac, is just like you said that a study hadn't been really done for 20 years, and like the techniques that you're using with the remote cameras are just so much different, right, than the techniques that you were describing at the beginning. And I just wonder if you just have any, any thoughts about the use of this these new technologies in terms of this kind of management strategies, and how that could maybe play a role in more effectively managing these different wildlife populations.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, one of the biggest things is that setting cameras and monitoring them can be done by one person, whereas the censuses that they were doing previously was like hundreds of people sometimes just to cover enough area. So that's a big deal. And then you also have more specific data, I think, from cameras than looking at like just drive data. As a deer runs by, I don't think you're likely to be like, this is how old I think that deer is. This is the gender. So you have a little bit more specific data, and it really is like looking at pictures it takes a lot of time, but when you look at kind of like the grand scheme of things compared to the labor that went into creating these censuses, it really is a lot less, a lot cheaper and a lot less labor to understand the herd using new technology, I guess.
So Mac, it says here that you are interested in pursuing a career in wildlife management. Are there any particular locations that would be your dream location, or types of taxa you'd be very interested in helping contribute to managing?
Yeah, sure. So I really like large mammals, I guess ungulates, if you will. And so specifically, I kind of want to move out west somewhere in the Rockies. So looking at elk or mule deer populations out there would be kind of a dream scenario. I also like a lot of fisheries kind of stuff and trout management, which I know there's a lot of jobs in that I've been looking at. And so, yeah, I'm just excited about future opportunities.
Well, excellent. Well, good luck to you. Keep us posted, and a really nice job on your work.
Thank you.
And so we'll now